Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week. That's right, it is your online Adulthood and Aging Psychology course, and I'm here to walk you through the hottest topics in death. Before I jump into this chapter, I just wanted to say thank you again for all your hard work this semester. This class format, ungrading, peer-to-peer teaching, very writing-based, high levels of student autonomy would not be possible without your participation. And in fact, the research articles that you select for your studies will be used kind of for future discussion posts. So thank you for contributing to kind of future cohorts learning opportunities, because this course, I adjust it every semester because this course is also in a continuous state of development as I receive feedback and hopefully improve myself as a professor. So again, thank you so much. So with that said, let's jump into this, our final chapter. Understanding death. Death has important social meaning. One person's death changes the roles and relationships of everything else in a family. Death brings many permanent changes in social systems. So we've talked about kind of spillover effects at the job, at a family, at your high school, your college, university, whatever, and how effects and development and just any event, an event that occurs within one environment kind of spilling over into other environments, and thus kind of those two environments kind of dynamically interacting with each other. So having a bad day at work, and then coming home, in the classic example of kicking your dog, and then your dog's relationship with you is now a little scarred, but kind of, more in general, stressed out at work, and maybe have a little short at home, a little irritated, something along those lines. You get laid off from a job. You do poorly on a test, you do great on a test, etc. All of these, the interactions we have in one environment kind of impacting the relationships we have in other environments, such as family, friends, community, etc. But for death, obviously, this is more of a permanent change. It's not that, oh, I did poorly on a test or I had a bad day, but rather kind of a permanent change in a social system. But the question possibly we should begin with is, what is death? Biological death is not a single process or a single event. It is a complex process. Different systems of the body die at different rates. Some people who have stopped breathing or lack a heartbeat would have been declared dead in another historical period can now be revived. Life support machines can be used to keep blood circulation going even after the person is non-responsive or in a vegetative state. Harvard Medical School in 1968 defined death as a total brain death, irreversible loss of functioning in the entire brain. Higher centers involved in conscious awareness, lower centers that control basic life processes. So here's a clear example of kind of a historical period that you live in impacting your definition of terms. So with the creation of life support machines and the ability to keep people alive, even though, or alive, I guess, but it's still I guess technically alive, even when they're non-responsive, they kind of have, there's a very low probability to zero probability that they would become, like kind of conscious and living and being able to be the person that you recognize when they're prior to whatever incident or illness occurred. And that thus introduces a new complexities in defining what death is. And then we have this Harvard Medical School definition, wherein, and this is kind of the classic example, where lower centers of your brain, so kind of brainstem around that area, kind of involved in blood circulation, breathing, kind of these automatic processes that we really don't focus on in general, that are required to exist or be alive, versus kind of those higher centers involved in conscious awareness. So kind of the thing that, quote unquote, makes us human, reasoning, just our conscious awareness of the things that we recognize in another person. And kind of this old, the 1968 definition was kind of a total irreversible loss, total brain death of both higher and lower centers of the brain. The American Academy of Neurology has a list of criteria to be judged dead. A person must be totally unresponsive to stimuli, including painful ones. Fail to move for 1 hour and fail to breathe for 3 minutes after being removed from a ventilator. No reflexes, no electrical activity in brain. And then you can even see here the historical period impacting understandings of death, and you can see at the top here different neuroimagings of a brain, of neurological activity, electrical activity, sorry, not electrical activity, but brain activities generally, without getting into the bio here. And obviously, neuroimaging technology at that level did not exist 50, 100, 200 years ago. Thus, having kind of the ability to brain scan advances in neuroimaging as kind of at a complexity or clarity in some cases, depending on your definition of death. And then here we see a different set of criteria to be judged death. So even in death, we have these competing definitions of what death is. Continuing on, euthanasia, quote, happy or, quote, good death that usually refers to hastening the death of someone suffering from an incurable illness or injury. Active euthanasia, mercy killing, deliberately and directly causing a person's death, administering a lethal dose of drugs to a pain-racked patient in the late stages of cancer, for example. Passive euthanasia, withdrawing extraordinary life-saving treatment, allowing a terminally ill person to die of natural causes, withholding extraordinary life-saving treatments, such as a feeding tube. Assisted suicide, making available to a person who wishes to die the means by which she may do so. A doctor's writing prescription for sleeping pills at the request of a terminally ill patient who has expressed his desire to die. So kind of we have three different types of, two different types of euthanasia, and then assisted suicide. With active euthanasia, these kind of definitions are straightforward. A medical professional kind of taking an active role. Typically, the easy example as stated is kind of a lethal dose of drugs for someone who has terminal cancer and is expected to die, in X amount, a very short period of time. And they are in a lot of pain. And a doctor administering a lethal dose of drugs would then therefore be kind of typically characterized as a mercy killing, and as stated, an active form of euthanasia versus passive form, really kind of just removing kind of these new technological innovations that are sustaining someone being alive, such as a feeding tube, for example. So kind of just taking away that life-saving treatment and then kind of allowing a natural progression of death to occur. So one kind of taking away something and then letting death naturally occur versus a lethal injection, active euthanasia. And then assisted suicide, typically when a patient requests to die, one way to do so, or one way to kind of fulfill that request for a medical professional, is to prescribe you some drugs or something along those lines. In that case, the suicide is assisted, but still the patient is kind of, in that case, the one who would be taking the medication. Death is also a psychological and social process. Aries argues social meanings of death have changed over the course of history. Since the late 19th century, Western societies have engaged in a, quote, denial of death, have taken death out of homes and into hospitals, funeral homes, less direct experience with it than our ancestors did. And what this scholar is arguing is that, kind of as stated, people in the West, and then specifically just talking about people in the U.S., have taken death out of their homes. So kind of a less direct experience with death, and kind of engaging overall, this person is arguing, kind of an overall, as a society, kind of denial of death. And there are a lot of competing reasons for this that he argues. And kind of like one classic kind of example is just really this idea of keeping someone alive at like all cost. That's kind of declined a little bit, and we'll talk about that a little later in the chapter, but keeping someone alive at all costs, no matter their pain, their suffering, or the likelihood of them being responsive. But also kind of the theoretical construct here is that, as we've talked about in U.S., kind of imagining yourself as the kind of almost a protagonist of the world. You have your own innate desires that are unmovable. You're on your own individual quest for self-discovery and accumulation of knowledge, or wealth or fame. Death kind of puts an end to that. It really puts a constraint on that narrative that you have kind of like this unlimited capacity to compile wealth and prestige. or fame, or clout, if you want. Talk from kind of social media terms. So kind of like that quest, and really the 18th century is the late 19th century, I should say, is really kind of the advent of like the Industrial Revolution. So really kind of this mass industrialization, where kind of like the society that for the next over 100 or so years. It brought about kind of manufacturing, people leaving farm areas, leaving their local communities, and entering these new cities on a quest to kind of acquire capital. It really kind of the modern versions of capitalism in the U.S. And alongside a large expansion of U.S. territory. So kind of like, so during this large cultural shift, this macro shift in like economics, will accompany kind of a shift in narrative in your, which kind of in that within that shift, it's again kind of this idea of this, I'm going to go to the city, I'm going to accumulate wealth. That's kind of the new way of operating in the world. And consequently, it's really kind of it could contribute to the likelihood of saying like, almost like I'm immortal. Like I'm on this never-ending process of accumulation with no limits, no constraints. I can go to the city, make as much wealth as I want. The country's opening up. We have this whole new frontier, this whole exploration. I can go west, and death kind of represents kind of a constraint on that, and a limitation, and an interconnected connection of vulnerability shared by the human race, which kind of challenges that. Is kind of what he's arguing here. But that's just one theoretical argument. But that's kind of what he's getting at here. Cross-cultural medical practices. Despite the fact that an international community of doctors exists, there still is much cultural variability in how doctors view health and physical ailments, because doctors are trained within their own culture, and so are products of their culture. This is particularly the case when we consider the metaphor with which doctors explain and understand the human body. For example, in China, the metaphor of yin and yang emphasize opposite forms in balance. Imbalances are believed to lead to illness. Imbalances can be corrected with acupuncture, herbal remedies, exercise, diet, and lifestyle. In France, the metaphor of the body is, quote, terrain, translated roughly into constitution or resistance, which emphasizes a sense of balance as the key to good health by supporting the immune system. French doctors prescribe fewer drugs, but more vitamins, long rest, and spa visits. Dirt and germs can strengthen one's terrain, thus there is less emphasis on daily bathing. U.S. metaphor of the body is a machine that needs to be tended regularly to make sure it's running well. If something is wrong with the body, then doctors fix that part of the body in the same way the machines are repaired. American doctors are more likely to do surgery to fix, remove, replace, or change different parts of the body. Germs are a key threat to health, and people should avoid germs to be healthy. Thus, doctors prescribe antibiotics in higher doses compared to any other country. So here we have kind of a different understanding of health, of life, of death, our relationship to others, with different metaphors of the body, the self. And we see here different kind of metaphors in China, France, and the U.S., but there are others as well. And reflecting that as kind of differences in preferences of medical treatments, and kind of overall, some societies emphasizing more preventative health, community health, or the willingness to engage in surgery, C-section, whatever, or removing a different body part, and the rates of medical prescriptions for medical drugs, for example, in the U.S. Opioids, for example, being U.S. kind of being a big outlier, kind of in rates of drug prescriptions and drug overdose, for that matter. Cultural variation in grieving. There's no one universal way to grieve. Funerals are on occasion for avoiding people or holding parties, for fighting or having sexual orgies, for weeping or laughing, and 1,000 different combinations. Mexican-American mourners do more viewing, touching, and kissing of the deceased than white Americans. Black Americans tend to regard the funeral as a form for expressing grief. Japanese Americans are socialized to restrain their grief, to smile so as not to burden others with their pain. Irish Americans have traditionally believed that the dead deserve a good send-off, a wake with food, drink, and jokes, the kind of party the deceased might have enjoyed. So again, various forms of grieving. There is no universal form of grieving or the correct form of grieving. These different forms of grieving kind of reflecting kind of the daily interactions when that person was alive, and the kind of conceptualizations of life and death. Now let's talk about some of the leading causes of death across the lifespan. In preschool and school children, unintentional injuries, car accidents; adolescent and early adulthood, car accidents, homicides, and suicides; the 45 to 64 age group, cancers; and 65 years and older, heart disease. The epidemiological paradox, which we've already alluded to in previous chapters, but sometimes you got to repeat when these topics are intercorrelated. Defined as poor or kind of conceptualized as poor and racial minorities cross-culturally are at higher risk of adverse health outcomes. Not all disadvantaged minorities have adverse health situations, however. Latinos in the US, for example. Researchers are not exactly certain why. Although they tend to exercise less, Latino Americans tend to be less likely to drink and smoke than non-Latino Americans. Cultural factors in Latino communities also contribute to relatively good health. High value placed on raising families, emotional support provided by family and community members, and unusually high levels of positive emotions. Paradox does not equally apply to all Latino groups, however. Puerto Ricans do not show some of the same unexplained health benefits as Mexican Americans. And interestingly enough, I should add, that researchers typically find that the longer that any community, and also in this case specifically Latino immigrants, the longer they are in the U.S., the longer or the less kind of they kind of lose some of these protective factors, which can be kind of related to a whole lot of things of kind of integrating into a more dominant U.S. monoculture, kind of stripping away those kind of protective elements. And some of those potential protective factors are high value placed on raising families, emotional support. So that strong social support, that strong network of buffering that acts as a protective measure against maybe some of the adverse environments that they may face. So that kind of that collective protective factor, again, kind of reducing the risk of dying prematurely. However, as stated, the paradox does not equally apply to all groups such as Puerto Ricans, and I've kind of alluded to this before, but one possible reason is kind of Puerto Rico kind of being in that middle status of basically being an informal colony, not being in their own country, being part of the U.S., but not having formal representation in government, and being kind of subjected to kind of dictates of beyond their control. And we just recently saw another large power outage, and we just know about the hurricanes that happened there recently. So kind of high amounts of stressors, trauma from natural disasters, economic disasters, kind of rooted in the history of Puerto Rico-U.S. relations, while at the same time having kind of a very limited degree of control, and evidence of the fact that they don't have any electoral votes for the U.S. Presidential election, for example, is one theoretical reason. And we talked about the subjective understanding of wealth in the previous chapter, but was kind of building on that a little bit. Mortality and class. General health is also affected by different aspects of our cultural environment, such as class indicators like household incomes. Mortality rates are higher among mortality rates, I should say, are higher among lower income Americans. Pattern can be found in other industrialized countries as well as certain non-industrialized countries. And this is kind of straightforward. More money, if you have a higher housing income, you're more likely, especially in the U.S., have access to better health care, better food. You're being more stable neighborhood environments, just an overall kind of advantage that over time can accumulate and contribute to longer lifespans. Death anxiety, defined as fear of death. Elements in fear of death include age, religiosity, gender, personality traits, sense of purpose, that is, discovery of satisfying personal goals, and the belief that one's life has been worthwhile. Let's go into a little detail here about the elements in fear of death. Age, middle-aged adults have the greatest fear of death. Older adults typically have lowest fear of death. Religiosity, no one-to-one / direct correlation between fear of death and religiosity. Might be inverted U shape. Low religiosity has low fear of death. High religiosity, low fear of death. And here's a visual illustration I made because I got annoyed with myself mid-explaining this. Made this in Paint. So you can see Y and X axis, the X axis being how religious you are, 0 to 100, with 100 being the most religious possible. And then fear of death, Y axis, 0 to 100, 100 being you're super fearful of death. And then you see the inverted U/N on the graph. And you can see what that means here is that at the lower, the far left side of that inverted U, you have low religious level, low fear of death, and on the far right of the figure, you have high amount of religiousness, and while also having a low fear of death. So that's basically what it's saying. So they're saying if you're super religious, you have low fear of death. If you're very low religious, you have very low fear of death. That's what that means. So basically what they're arguing, so that's just one theoretical model. But overall, then this is great. There is no one-to-one direct correlation between how fearful you are of death and how religious you are. And then the differences between ages may be kind of like middle-aged adults kind of being like, oh man, I'm about to die soon, half my life is over, versus kind of older adults who are more likely to be more accepting of death, understanding whatever that they've kind of completed their life, and are more because they have that understanding, are kind of willing to accept it and just kind of want to live out their final years of their lives in as positive as a way, or as possible, or in a way that somehow contributes to society as much as possible. Gender, one study in Egypt found women have higher levels of fear, but it's not always consistent, kind of these gender differences. It might have to do with different religious interpretations across different religions in different countries. A sense of purpose and life, high levels of regret associated with higher levels of death anxiety. So maybe you're just like, oh man, I wasted my life. I have all these regrets. I'm not ready to die. I have to whatever, fix my life or get better. I've wasted my life kind of idea. So, it's one possible reason why the higher levels of regret associated with higher levels of death anxiety. That positive correlation. Accepting the realities of one's eventual death. This involves multiple processes, and here's some definitions of some of the processes. Finitude, process of coming to grips with one's eventual death, occurs over time at many levels. Reminiscence, a review of one's personal memories. Living will, legal document that states a person's end-of-life decisions. Organ transplant donor. Individuals who agreed to the transplantation at the time of death of his or her usable organs and other tissue to approved recipients. Only about 45% of people in the United States are registered as organ donors, and you can do so, I believe, at the DMV. But kind of the idea here is you can see it's kind of straightforward with living will and reminiscing, kind of recognizing that you're going to die, so I'm going to create a will. So this kind of stuff. So whatever my assets are. People don't have to fight about my remaining assets or something and cause family friction after my death. Reminiscing, kind of just straightforward, just discussing all the great times you had, or the bad times you had, but are in retrospect kind of funny now, with your loved ones, your family, friends, maybe community. So kind of representing kind of the social process or social development, really, about accepting the inevitability of death. Ross's 5 stages of dying. This is the classic 5 stages of dying that most people are exposed to. The first being denial, conceptualized as a defense mechanism, anxiety-provoking. Thoughts are kept out of conscious awareness. Anger, questions such as why me, and kind of being angry. Bargaining, the bargainer begs for some concessions from God, the medical staff, or family members. So keep me alive in exchange for me being nice moving forward. The 4th stage is depression. Depression, despair, and a sense of hopelessness become the predominant emotional responses. And finally, acceptance. Accept the inevitability of death in a calm and peaceful manner. Some of the criticisms of the Ross model include emotional responses to dying are not stage-like. The nature and course of an illness affects reaction to it. People differ widely in their responses, and dying people focus on living, not just dying. So kind of the idea here is the Ross model is a classic stage theorist. We've talked about stage theorists throughout this class, but kind of again, imagining it as a set of stairs, and then you have to go through each step in the stairs in that exact order. And at each kind of step, at each stage, you kind of unlock a new ability, new cognitive development. So literally in this case, you have a different understanding of death at each cognitive stage. Now, there are people who are not stage theorists who would argue with that, and specifically in this context here, some of the critique is that emotional responses are not in this uniform stage-like process. You don't have to go in that exact order. Maybe you start with bargaining, maybe you start with anger, maybe you go back and forth and jump around, something along those lines. So it's not kind of like this uniform progression of stages of dying. Also, the nature and course of the illness could affect the reactions to it. So there's a big difference between a young child dying versus 100-year-old spouse dying, for example. And the degree of it is an unexpected death. Did you get hit by randomly an asteroid, or did you have a terminal illness that you knew about for 30 years and you're like, okay, when I'm 80, this is going to happen to me. So kind of the nature and course of the illness affecting what the stages of dying, the extent that they exist, the stages of dying progression, or kind of the overall just emotional reaction and understanding of death. And as stated with grieving, similar response here. Dying, people interpret dying in the responses to death in different ways across culture. And also dying people focus on living, not just dying. So they're not fully focused on the fact, okay, that I'm going to die, but rather often are trying to maximize the amount of time that they have remaining and not kind of being in this state of depression, anger, bargaining, etc. And building on that, perspectives on dying. One study found dying patients have goals. Controlling dying, primarily by focusing on their chemotherapy and other treatments, but also, for some, by holding in the back of their mind the possibility of suicide if necessary. Valuing life in the present, getting the most out of their remaining time, even if they can no longer make long-term plans. Creating a living legacy, getting their affairs in order, creating good memories in their children, touching others' lives. So kind of speaking to that previous bullet point that people are dying, not solely focused on their own personal death, but rather having their own goals, which again includes controlling dying, valuing life in the present, creating a legacy. So getting the most out of the time that they have left, contributing to society if they want to, but also just establishing and kind of patching up relationships with people that matter to them throughout their lives. And then at the same time, understanding that if this illness becomes terminal and there's just nothing I can do about it, then having in the back of their mind something like euthanasia or assisted suicide, as we covered early on in the lecture. Perspectives on bereavement. Bereavement can be defined as a state of loss. Grief, emotional response to loss, and mourning, culturally prescribed way of displaying reactions to death. And one model of bereavement is the Parks-Bowlby attachment model of bereavement. And you should be familiar with Bowlby, kind of from the attachment research. This model describes 4 prominent reactions to death. Numbness is one reaction, and a day's sense of unreality and disbelief and almost empty of feelings. Yearning, a time of acute separation anxiety and efforts to reunite with the lost loved one. Disorganization and despair. As a realization of reunion with the loved one is impossible, depression, despair, and apathy predominate. Reorganization. Invest less emotional energy in their attachment to the deceased and more in their attachment to the living. So kind of classic examples here. And there's a critique of this that we'll get to later on in the lecture. But kind of the idea here, kind of straightforward: numbness, disbelief of death, yearning, some kind of separation anxiety, then disorganization, depression with death, and then a reorganization. Kind of the idea here is that, okay, I'm going to detach myself from the person who dies, and then instead attach myself to people who are alive, is what this model is arguing. Another model is the dual process model of bereavement. Bereavement oscillates, often unpredictably, between coping with the emotional blow of the loss and coping with practical challenges of the living. There are two types of coping in this model, just thus the dual process model. Loss-oriented coping involves dealing with one's emotions and reconciling oneself of the loss, with the loss, I should say. Restoration-oriented coping focus on managing daily living, rethinking one's life, mastering the new roles and challenges that come following the loss of a loved one. Over time, emphasis shifts from loss-oriented to restoration-oriented coping, also seen at the family level of child's death. So kind of the idea here is that we have within a person, an individual, kind of bouncing back and forth between these two processes, one being loss-oriented, the other being restoration-oriented. The loss-oriented kind of associated with typical kind of understandings of death, breaking of bonds, relocation, maybe denial, grief, kind of intrusive grief thoughts that occur. And you're kind of just really kind of involves, again, kind of dealing with that loss, emotionally processing that loss and reconciling yourself with that, versus more restoration, again, kind of a straightforward term here, doing new things, taking on new roles, identity, relationships, taking on new responsibilities. But kind of the idea here is that these two kind of components interact with each other. So maybe you take on a new role and a new identity, but maybe that can remind you of, whoever died, and that can lead to an intrusion of grief. Or maybe it can cause you to, by taking on a new role, cause you to break bonds or relocate away from family, for example. So maybe you want to go travel or to take some job in some other place would cause you to relocate. So kind of the idea here is that these two processes are interacting dynamically within an individual. But also interestingly, this is seen at the family level. So you can conceptualize each person having this kind of two components, but also your own two components interacting with other people's components. So if there's a death in the family, especially kind of a child's death, you can see all these different roles being formed, emotional processing, denial, avoidance, or acceptance kind of interacting dynamically within a household and or family. Advanced understandings of death, looking at adolescence, and I wasn't sure if I was going to include this, but I ultimately decided to do so because typically adolescent death, or a lot of the times I should say, includes like a loss of a family member who's an older adult or a parent, grandparent, etc. So it's, all these things are interrelated, but so I think it's useful in this course. So adolescents typically understand death as an irreversible cessation of biological processes, use their new cognitive capacities to ponder the meaning of death. Some think that psychological functions such as knowing, believing, and feeling continue. Among the adolescents who adopt the belief that the soul or spirit lives on after death does not mean they are giving up a biological understanding of death. Those adolescents call upon both as needed, depending on the situation and what they are trying to explain. So kind of the idea here is that with this, these cognitive advances of way of understanding the world from a Piaget model or from a different model such as or kind of like cultural learning and accumulation of knowledge, more of a Vygotsky model. We haven't talked about that. You're not tested on it, it's fine. But regardless, some combination of cognitive development and like cultural learning, contributing to a different capacities to ponder the meaning of death, and having new interpretations of death, versus like a 3-year-old, for example. These interpretations of death can include secular and non-secular kind of understandings of biological death, and adolescents, depending on the culture, the level of religiousness of that adolescent, utilizing both to interpret and kind of process death. And kind of being able to bounce between those competing definitions of or understandings of death, soul, spirit, the spirituality, religion, etc. But also kind of secular biological death. So kind of being able to bounce between those understandings and conceptualizations of death as needed. Kind of, again, alluding to some combination of enhanced cognitive capacity and cultural learning. Scholars argue that adolescents' reactions to becoming terminally ill are likely to reflect the themes of adolescence. They have concerns with body image, wanting to be accepted by peers, and distress by having to depend on their parents. So kind of the idea here is that just because adolescent is terminally ill does not mean they are no longer adolescents. They are still concerned by some of the same themes of their adolescence life across their lifespans. So kind of those themes continue even though they are terminally ill. So themes such as wanting to be accepted by peers and depending on the culture, being distressed by having to depend on your parents, kind of losing that independence is one source of kind of concern. Again, kind of despite being terminally ill, still being kind of focused on the development of the self or identity, in kind of a Western context. So, but regardless of the context, still being kind of affected by the cultural norms of adolescence. Losing a parent also reflects the themes of adolescence. Reluctant to express grief, may engage in delinquent behavior and somatic ailments. Reactions to death of a parent. 30% of adolescents experience significant grief reactions in the first year following the death of a parent, and these are adolescents. 10% 3 years later, the rest, which basically means they're emerging adulthood at that point. 10% years later, the rest experience milder grief. More likely to suffer major depression, alcohol abuse, PTSD in the first year of life. So kind of we see a kind of a decline in the risk associated with alcohol abuse and grief and PTSD following or as years progress. With the first year in this study found about 30% experiencing significant grief and being at the most risk for, as stated, kind of alcohol abuse and PTSD. But with time, that's still kind of a fairly small number, but still a very sizable number, an important number. But 3 years later, once they hit emerging adulthood, it's about 90% of emerging adults who experience the death of a parent not experiencing mild grief, but still about 10% doing so. And as stated, the first year is kind of the riskiest year of negative developmental outcomes in adolescents who lose their parent. Other reactions to death of a parent include cortisol levels have been found to be higher in bereaved youth compared to non-bereaved youth. Bereaved youth are less likely to have close attachment to peers, have more difficulties at work, lower educational aspirations, and less developed career plans. Outcomes worse for those who blamed others for the death, had low self-esteem, used negative coping strategies, had a caregiver who was severely depressed. So a few takeaways here. So if the living parent becomes very depressed for obvious reasons, that can still have an impact on the emerging adult or adolescent's development. With the remaining partner having not being able to kind of offer kind of protective protection to this traumatic event for their child for obvious reasons. They are also they're also depressed. And those youths are at higher risk of having worse long-term developmental outcomes, such as performing worse at school, having difficulties at work, and substance abuse. But interestingly, kind of again, like everything else, the social support that is associated with lower risk for worse developmental outcomes. And we also see, and then another kind of a big point here is bereaved youth having less likely to have close attachments to peers. So kind of again, kind of a traumatic stimulus happens in an environment. That traumatic stimulus impacts social relationships. And those social relationships can that deterioration, specifically a deterioration of social relationships, which can isolate the adolescent. And you can imagine having isolation, losing your peers, having a depressed remaining parent. And so kind of being on your own, and those circumstances is when those adolescents, those emerging adults, are most at risk for negative developmental outcomes. In adulthood, the death of or the loss of a spouse or partner often precipitates the need to move, entering the labor force, or changing jobs, assuming responsibilities that the partner formerly performed, parenting single-handedly, and coping with less money. So it's not just the loss of your loved one, but also this can all these other unstabilizing kind of shifts in a person's environment can occur. So you have to now parent single-handedly. You have as we talked about, most homes are kind of dual income households. So now you've lost a significant part of that income. You may have to therefore change jobs and move somewhere else. So all these kind of destabilizing reactions to death can occur, kind of compounding the loss of your spouse or partner, not just within that spouse or partner, but also within the larger family and children, children and extended families, depending on the makeup of the house. And continuing on and looking specifically at the loss of a child from a kind of parent's perspective, it seems unexpected, untimely, and unfair. Unable to make sense of a child's death, age of the child who dies has little effect on the severity of the grief. Siblings also grieve, but may not have support from parents. Study found that only 12% of parents whose young adult's child died of accident, suicide, or homicide said they found meaning a year later. 5 years later, only 57% found meaning in their child's death. Outcomes on marriage are likely to be worse if the marriage was unstable before the death of a child. So this is an example of the death in the process of grieving and making meaning. Differs widely depending on who dies. So in this case, a young child, but parents in general interpret it as unexpected, untimely, and unfair, which makes sense. You wouldn't expect a lifespan of a child or lifespan of a person to be whatever between 0 and 18 years old. And you kind of see this in this one specific study where even 5 years after death, about not half, but 33% of parents still having really found no meaning in their child's sudden untimely death, because it's still in their minds unfair. That person should not have died. Kind of in general, kind of the classic understanding is parents die before children, and kind of seeing your child's death can be extremely difficult to find meaning. But there are, kind of the study found that there is increased meaning and purpose found in parents, but still, as stated, about 40% of 40% of parents 5 years later still struggling to find kind of meaning from their child's death. And as we talked about throughout this course, every single day you aren't this magical new person, but rather you're bringing your entire developmental trajectory with you. You're in this case, your relationship with your partner, your husband, wife, existed prior to the death of this child. So if that relationship was rocky prior to the death of the child, the death of a child is a significant risk factor that can contribute to a further deterioration of that already unstable relationship. Because again, each of these events that occur within your life, you're bringing along with you kind of your developmental history and with yourself and your developmental or I should say your quality of your social relationships with you across the lifespan is kind of similar. We talked about kind of with marriage, kind of the idea that that getting married, you're magically going to fix everything. These social relationships are with you, and then they're interacting and encountering new stimuli constantly. And the people who are already at risk or are already unstable are going to be at elevated risk when a traumatic event such as the loss of a child occurs. Suicide rates and motives across cultures. Suicide is recognized across cultures, but its frequency rates vary dramatically around the world. It also appears to be triggered by a wide range of conditions. Eastern Europeans tend to have the highest rates, while Muslim nations tend to have the lowest rates. Suicide rates also vary depending on one's age, with elderly people generally being more likely to commit suicide in most cultures. There is a special case in Micronesia in which there was a spike in adolescent age group, starting primarily in the 1970s when a spate of suicides occurred among adolescent men over seemingly trivial problems with no obvious psychological issues to begin with. Suicides were also restricted to specific islands, particularly the suburban regions of those islands. Some have suggested the spike was due to westernization of the island, which led to a loss of traditional roles of young men and were part of a series of copycat suicides. So as stated, suicide being recognized across all culture with regional variation in the frequency of suicide, but also kind of the potential reasons for suicide across cultures. And in one case, looking at Micronesia in the 1970s, and kind of an interesting historical example, and kind of the impact of or I should say, in Micronesia, we saw a spike in suicide rates, and one possible reason that some researchers have argued is that westernization on the island, which kind of stripped of the culture of cultural practices, economic practices, really kind of ways of socially organizing yourself and the type of social relationships that occurred within that culture, thus losing kind of a sense of who you are, your traditional role, which, I mean, strengths and weaknesses to traditional roles, but this is kind of a large shift and a different way of interpreting the world that's kind of all of a sudden just exist, and kind of navigating through that world and or failing to navigate through that world can have life or death consequences. And kind of building on that, losing connection between one's culture narrative in modern society, lack of cultural continuity, seems to put people at risk for suicide. Similar concerns have been raised among many native populations in westernized nations, such as First Nation bands in Canada. Suicide rates of First Nations adolescents is 5 times that of mainstream adolescents. They have a low sense of identification with traditional culture due to Western colonization, yet have difficulties relating to mainstream Canadian culture. Research has shown that having more connections with traditional culture predicts lower suicide rates. So what this is getting at is the kind of younger First Nations people who are developing, kind of being stuck between two personalities or two worlds, with kind of a low sense of traditional identification with their traditional culture because they were literally physically stopped from doing so. And you can kind of see this in if you're interested, just Google kind of the boarding schools in Canada that has been uncovered for the last year or two of just mass graves of boarding schools. And the boarding schools were basically there. First Nations, Indigenous people in Canada were sent to these boarding schools to basically be taught a westernized way of thinking, removing them of their cultural traditions and their language, and also just kind of mass killing them. And there's some thousands of dead bodies found at these Catholic boarding schools in Canada, if you're interested. But even in less like that direct level of violence, kind of that overall what happened to First Nations Indigenous people still live today. These people still exist, and they have to navigate a world that wherein they have to adapt to kind of the reality that exists around them, but also while still trying to maintain some degree of interconnectivity to their past and present culture. Research has found that the more that First Nation communities can connect with their cultural history, the lower their suicide rates are. The communities that have the strongest number of connections have suicide rates that are comparable with those of the Canadian average. These connections include having one's own political body, maintaining control over educational services, cultural facilities that promote a community's cultural history, having its own policing or law enforcement organization, whether a community is negotiating a claim to territorial land, I should say. The more these indicators are present, the lower the risk of suicide. And we've reviewed some of this in our course, in our discussions, kind of the idea of cultural practices and being stripped of those cultural practices being associated not with just suicide, but drug abuse and just worse kind of physical health development, social development, psychological development, being associated with a higher risk of psychological disorders and chronic illnesses. And these connections offering protective factors, and they're kind of straightforward here: autonomy, power, interconnectivity. So having one's own political body, maintaining control of educational services. I just talked about that. Literally, those boarding schools wherein they were native children were stripped away from kind of their understanding of the world and their educational pedagogy. What education means, how it's applied in practice. What the responsibilities are of educational services, etc. So kind of having that autonomy, that control, that ability to dictate your future, and having that interpersonal and community-based institutions are critical for development. And actually, one of the first reasons why I got interested in developmental psychology was kind of looking at or running across a book or an interview, really, of drug abuse within Canada, and their high rates of opioid addiction and death from drug overdose, and kind of being a huge outlier, and also alcoholism, and being huge outliers, and this traditionally not happening, 200, 300 years ago. So the question is, okay, why is this happening? And then, then I got kind of down the rabbit hole of, these larger kind of like systems, this historical developmental record matter right now. And thus kind of looking at individual behaviors can be very much influenced by these historical processes and these structures in which people develop in. And there's not that I'm aware of, there might be research. When I talked about Puerto Rico a few slides ago, you can look at these connections include here, and how I was talking about the kind of the lack of autonomy and control, and kind of being in that in between world of being an independent state and being part of the United States. And looking at the connections listed on the screen, you can see that Puerto Ricans really don't have that level of control, the connections, which may, again, kind of conceptually, theoretically here, be contributing to that not having that buffering, that epidemiological paradox, that buffering of interconnectivity, protecting against worse health outcomes within that community. Another model of grief that I want to talk about is the grief work perspective. The grief work perspective is a view that to cope adaptively with death, bereaved people must first confront their loss, experience painful emotions and work through those emotions, and move toward a detachment from the deceased. It's derived from the legacy of Freudian psychoanalytic theory and is held widely in our society. Some of the criticisms of the grief work model include cross-cultural studies have found that there are many ways to grieve. The model may be culturally biased. There is little support for the assumption that bereaved individuals must confront their loss and experience painful emotions. There is no support for the view that we must break our bonds. Bereavement rituals in some cultures are designed to ensure a continued bond between the living and the dead. So kind of the idea here, and this is again kind of a classic idea, is that you have to confront your loss, you have to feel that emotion, that pain, work through those emotions and that pain, and then ultimately move on from that person, detach from that person, and then move on with your life and do whatever it is that you have to do. So it's kind of process of confrontation, processing, and then moving on. However, many cultures are not designed to kind of do that. In fact, many cultural rituals are designed to continue the bond between the living and the dead. It's not really seen as, you're stuck in the past, or you're not moving on, or some kind of negative evaluation associated with still maintaining a bond with a person who is dead, but rather something that is emphasized and thought to maybe possibly represent interconnectivity of living and dead, or intergenerational interconnectivity, for example. So kind of in fact, so kind of that model could actually be a source of stress and harmful to kind of dealing with kind of the natural processes. And when I just mean natural, I mean the processes that exist within a particular culture, and that kind of that can have a disruptive effect and actually be harmful to the person who is still living. There's also little support for the idea that you have to feel that pain. You have to confront those emotions, take them head on, and process them and feel that pain. Some people do not want to take on that pain, or have this huge confrontation where I'm one-on-one with my emotions, and then come to this final solution to how to deal with this, or process this death of a loved one. Some people do not have to have that severity of emotional grief, or some people kind of avoid that grief process at all costs, or at all costs, or it may not be culturally relevant, and to experience that, and also kind of to experience those painful emotions to the nth degree. So the kind of that, and this is a classic model of the West, which again. Is really not applicable across cultures, but even within kind of the West, this is not like this universal process that everybody has to go through, and can, again, in fact, be harmful. So then the question is, how do people? What are some successful ways of coping? How is coping influenced? Or what are some factors that influence coping? Coping with bereavement is influenced by individuals' personal resources, such as their coping style, their secure attachment associated with coping relatively well after a death. Secure attachment, I should say, is associated with coping relatively well after death. The nature of the loss, violent deaths and child deaths are harder to cope with. And the surrounding context of collective support and stressors. Social support aids in coping. Additional life stressors harm coping. Siblings can help each other cope. Adult children can help widowed parents. Bereaved individuals report that they are most helped when they are allowed to express painful feelings, freely if and when they choose, rather than trying to cheer them up or talk them out of grief. So we already talked about kind of the loss of a child and unexpected death of a spouse or any family member or someone or a personal friend being affected by kind of the expectation of death, the understanding that, or does that person have a terminal illness, the age of that person, kind of the expectation of death based on the age and physical health and psychological health of that person. Also, kind of the coping style can be influence how well a person copes. So kind of how you're kind of confronting death. Are you? Is it so painful that you become super depressed and become super avoidant, socially isolate yourself, abuse drugs, which all can have a negative effect on a person. But also the collective support and stressors with social support in the family, friends, neighborhood, etc., contributing to more positive coping versus additional life stressors, kind of straightforward here, contributing to kind of worse coping or worse developmental trajectories following the death of a loved one. And interestingly, bereaved individuals, studies who just ask bereaved individuals what do you need, and they report that in circumstances where they feel they are able to express themselves but aren't forced to express themselves or forced to be happy and not feel grief. Kind of this idea that that kind of exists, and just speaking for U.S., I can't talk about all cultures, but in the U.S., kind of this idea that get rid of all negativity in your life. You gotta just have positive, focus on that grind mindset. Get rid of all the negative people in your life. It's all about like this internal happiness state, and having that that your eye on the prize. Have those daily affirmations, manifest it, kind of thing. But that's kind of again kind of using online speak here. It's kind of invalidating. You're trying, you're telling that person, hey, cheer up, get over. You're basically effectively telling them, get over it. You should be feeling happy. You shouldn't be feeling grief. It's time to, again, move on with your life. Disassociate yourself with that person who's dying. And in fact, by you having those internal feelings of grief and sadness, you're kind of hurting yourself, and you're causing your own self to have this elongated negative experience that is not necessary. And bereaved individuals report that is not the way to go. Instead, allowing them to express painful feelings, but when they choose, kind of on their own time, and allowing those feelings, that emotional processing, to kind of take its natural path within that person. And jumping ahead to hospice care. Hospice is a program that supports dying people and their families through a philosophy of, quote, caring rather than a, quote, curing. Part of palliative care movement, aimed primarily at bringing comfort to and meeting the physical, psychological, and spiritual needs of patients with serious illnesses. The dying person and his family, not the, quote, experts, decide what support they want and need. Attempts to cure the patient or prolong his life are de-emphasized, but death isn't hurried either. Pain control is emphasized. The setting for care is as normal as possible. Bereavement counseling is provided to the family before and after the death. Studies suggest that relatives of dying people rate their quality of death experience more positively and display fewer symptoms of grief and have a greater sense of well-being 1 to 2 years after death than those who do not receive hospice care. So kind of the idea here is moving a little away from that idea of curing, and instead kind of reintegrating the person who is dying kind of back into their family network, and meeting their physical needs, their psychological needs, and their spiritual needs. So kind of bringing in the family, their loved ones, into kind of the process and deciding what they need, what they want, how they want to spend their remaining years, months, days, how they want to do so, so kind of removing that dying person from hospital settings, and instead to kind of reorienting them back into kind of as much into kind of their typical routine, their typical social context as much as possible, allowing kind of the family to kind of better process the death of their loved one, while at the same time allowing that remaining time to kind of be in a context that isn't as less kind of ominous or eerie as kind of a hospital setting. And as stated, kind of studies have shown that families who partake in kind of hospice care have a greater sense of well-being and fewer symptoms of grief following the death of their loved one. For the bereaved, most bereaved individuals do not need psychological interventions to cope with the loss of a loved one. Those at risk for complicated grief, some treatments include cognitive behavioral therapy, family therapy, and public health programs addressing root inequality. So example with kind of palliative care, and having those resources available to integrate people back into your household and meeting those physical and psychological needs takes financial resources. So that's kind of like public health programs that kind of provide those kind of that welfare, that's social safety net for people would be helpful. But also kind of cognitive behavioral therapy, which we've talked about before, and then family therapy. So kind of integrating the entire family and kind of this therapy process wherein they can kind of work together as a unit to process the death of their loved one. All right, with that said, let's wrap up this class. Themes of the text include nature and nurture interact in development. Their development proceeds in multiple directions. There is much plasticity in development. Conclusions about development, human relations, and human behavior are at the roots of these macro Bronfenbrenner systems, and how we interact with each other. We develop in a cultural, political, economic, and historical context. These contexts interact dynamically, impacting personal, community, and societal development. Structure/environment are associated with probabilities and a risk of developmental outcomes and behaviors. Development is a lifelong process, and development is best viewed from multiple perspectives. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for taking this time, for all your hard work this semester. I appreciate it a lot. If you ever need anything or just want to chat, feel free to reach out to me at any time. Thank you so much.